Good morning students. Today's topic is pollination. As we have learnt in the previous sections that male and female gamete in flowering plants are produced in pollen grain and embryo sac respectively. That is, pollen grain produces male gamete from the generative cell and embryo sac produces female gamete. As both the types of gametes are non-motile, they have to brought together for fertilization, and this is achieved by a special mechanism called as pollination. Pollination is the mechanism to achieve this objective. Transfer of pollen grains that are shed from the anther to the stigma of the pistil is termed as pollination. Flowers have evolved an amazing array of adaptations to achieve pollination. They make use of external agents like wind, water, animals, etc. to achieve this pollination. Depending on the source of pollen, pollination can be divided into three types. Autogamy, that is pollination within the same flower. Geitonogamy, that is pollination between the flowers of the same plant. And xenogamy, that is pollination between the flowers of the two different plants but of same species. When the gametes belong to the same genetic constitution, then the pollination is known as self-pollination. If the gametes have different genetic constitution, the pollination is known as cross-pollination. Let us see what is self-pollination. When the pollen transfers from the anther of this flower to the stigma of the same flower, then the pollination is termed to be self-pollination. Or if the pollen are transferred to the flower of the same plant, then also the transfer is self-pollination. But if the pollen of one flower transfers to the stigma of the another flower on the other plant, then the pollination is known as cross-pollination, since the genetic constitution of the gametes are changed. Let us discuss types. Autogamy. Pollination is achieved within the same flower. Normally the flower which opens, their anther and stigma are exposed. Complete autogamy is rare in such flowers because complete autogamy requires synchronized pollen release and stigma receptivity so that anther and stigma can give and take the pollen, but also the anther and stigma should lie close to each other. It always results in self-pollination. Some plants such as Viola, Commelina, Oxalis produce two types of flowers, chasmogamous and clistogamous. In chasmogamy, anther and stigma are exposed, but in clistogamy, flowers do not open at all and the anther and stigma lie close to each other. So the pollen released from the anther compulsorily goes to the stigma of the same flower. Hence, it increases the chances of self-pollination. Clistogamous flowers produce a short set of seeds because there is no chance of cross-pollination. Next is geitonogamy. Involves transfer of pollen from one flower to another flower, that is, anther of one flower releases pollen and the pollen transfers to the stigma of another flower but on the same plant. It's look like cross-pollination, but genetically it is self-pollination because pollen comes from the same plant. Xenogamy is the transfer of pollen from anther to stigma of flower on the different plants but of the same species. It is the only type of pollination in which genetically different pollen grains are brought to the stigma. This often requires a pollinator. Pollinators, that are agents of pollinations. Plant uses two types of agents, abiotic, that is wind and water, and biotic, that is animal and human. Majority of plants use biotic agents and only few uses abiotic, because in case of abiotic agents there are uncertainties with loss of pollen. To compensate this loss, more pollen are produced in such plants as compared to the ovules produced in the embryo sac of the ovary of the plants. So first is anemophily, that is pollination by wind. It is more common in abiotic agents. Quite common in grasses. Characteristics of plants are different which are pollinated by wind. For example, pollen are light and non-sticky, well exposed stamen, large often feathery stigma to trap airborne pollen grains. Flowers have single ovule as loss of pollen is very common in anemophily. Numerous flowers are packed into an inflorescence, example corn cob. Tassels with a stigma and style wave in the wind to trap pollen grains. It is very common in grasses. Let us see these characteristics. Characteristics of flowers that are pollinated by wind. They have no scent or nectar. The flowers are not brightly colored because they do not have to attract animals. Pollen is very light and it is produced in large quantities because wastage is substantial. The stamen are long so that they release pollen easily into the air. Similarly, stigma and style are also very long so that they are exposed to air to trap pollen. Hydrophily is the pollination by water. It is quite rare in flowering plants, limited to about only 30 genera of monocotyledon plants. We should recall that it is a very common mode of gamete transfer in algae, bryophytes and pteridophytes. But some examples of flowering plants are Vallisneria and Hydrilla, which are freshwater plants, and seagrasses like Zostera is a marine plant. Not all aquatic plants use water for pollination. In majority of aquatic plants such as water hyacinth and water lily, the flowers emerge above the level of the water and are pollinated by insects or wind. In Vallisneria, the female flower reach the surface of the water by long stalk and the male flowers or pollen are released onto the surface of the water. They are carried passively by water currents. Some of them eventually reach the female flowers and the stigma. In another group, such as seagrasses, female flowers remain submerged in the water and the pollen grains are released inside the water. Such pollen grains in many species are long, ribbon-like, and they are carried passively inside the water. Some of them reach stigma and achieve pollination. In most of the water pollinated species, pollen grains are protected from wetting by mucilaginous cover. In lotus, insects pollinate the flowers. In tape seagrass, pollen are released inside the water and reaches the submerged female flowers and pollinate them so that fertilization may occur. Pollination in seagrass is different from pollination in Vallisneria, as in Vallisneria the female flowers reaches the surface of the water and the male flowers are released to the surface of the water. The female flowers receive the male flower and get fertilized by the male gametes. Majority of flowering plants use animals as their pollinators. They use pollinating agents like bee, butterfly, fly, beetles, wasp, ant, moth, birds, and bats. Among these, bees are dominating pollinators. Even larger animals like primates, lemurs, arboreal rodents, or even reptiles like gecko lizard and garden lizard have reported as a potential pollinator. Often flowers of animal pollinated plants are specifically adapted for particular species of animals. Majority of insect pollinated flowers are large, colorful, fragrant and rich in nectar. When flowers are small, number of flowers are clustered which make them conspicuous and animals do not get attracted. So, to attract the animals, color and fragrance are must. To sustain insect visit, flowers have to provide rewards to them. Nectar and pollen grains are usual floral rewards. For harvesting the rewards from the flower, insect comes in contact with the anther and the stigma. The body of animal gets coating of pollen grains which are generally sticky in these flowers. When insect carrying pollen on its body comes in contact with the stigma of the flower of the same plant or the other plant, it brings about pollination. Characteristics of entomophily plants: they emit strong smell like in jasmine and larkspur. Some of the pollen are used as food like magnolia. They have pollen kit which is sticky. Stigma are also sticky. Flowers are stronger in order to bear the weight of the insect. In some species, floral rewards are in providing safe places to lay eggs. Example is the tallest flower of Amorphophallus, which is about 6 feet in height. A similar relationship exists between the yucca and the moth, where both the species, moth and yucca, cannot complete their life cycle without each other, that is, they share symbiotic relationship. The moth deposits its eggs in the locule of the ovary and the flower and in turn gets pollinated by the moth. The larvae of the moth come out of the eggs as the seeds start developing. If we patiently observe the flowers for a few days and at different times of the day, we also see the correlation in the characteristics of flower and the animal that visits it. Such floral visitors are referred to as pollen or nectar robbers. Outbreeding devices. Hermaphrodite flowers facilitate self-pollination because of close contact of pollen with stigma. But if the self-pollination continues, it results in inbreeding depression, that means reduced biological fitness. Flowering plants have to develop many devices to discourage this inbreeding depression and must increase the chances of cross-pollination. Devices to prevent autogamy include: first, pollen release and stigma receptivity should not be synchronized, that is, they should not be done at the same time. Either pollen is released before the stigma becomes receptive, or the stigma becomes receptive before the pollen releases. Second device is that anther and stigma should be placed at the different positions so that they cannot come in contact. Both these devices prevent autogamy. Some other devices are self-incompatibility, which is a genetic mechanism and prevent pollen from fertilizing the ovules by inhibiting the pollen germination or the pollen tube growth in the pistil of the flower. Second is production of unisexual flowers on the same plant as in castor and maize, that is monoecious. Parent is same but the flowers are different. But here only autogamy is prevented but not geitonogamy. So production of unisexual flowers on different plants is also favored as in papaya, that is dioicy, so that the parents are different, both the plants are different, and this condition prevents autogamy and geitonogamy both. In the next lecture, we will be studying pollen pistil interaction, artificial hybridization, double fertilization, and some post fertilization structure and events. Till then, you should read the content thoroughly.